Hello and welcome back to another episode of Majlis and Markets with your host Hassan Jivraj. Majlis and Markets brings you thought-provoking conversations with influential leaders in Islamic and global markets. Before we start, as usual, wherever you're listening to us, please remember to like, share and subscribe. It really does help us out. You can now also send your comments, questions, feedback and suggestions to our email hassan@majlisandmarkets.com. In today's episode, we're talking about Turkey's economy. Since the country's presidential elections in May 2023, Turkey's economic policy has undergone significant change. Mehmet Şimşek, now the finance minister, signals a return to orthodox economic policy making. This includes raising interest rates and implementing key economic reforms. However, challenges persist, including a weak currency, high inflation, and declining FDI. Moreover, the March 2024 local elections marked a critical moment as Erdogan and the AKP suffered a major defeat. To gain deeper insights into this, we spoke with Serhat Suha Çubukçoglu from Trends Research and Advisory. During our discussion, we discussed the implications of these changes, its impacts, and the challenges facing Turkey's economy. Serhat Suha Çubukçoglu, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Good to have you here.
Good to have you. Thank you very much, Hassan, for having me on this show. Thank you.
Serhat, I reached out to you probably last year when I was working at a publication and writing about Turkey. I think at that time it was about the Turkish presidential elections. Back in May 2023. It feels weird, like it's already been a year, and it just feels like yesterday I reached out to you. And since then, I've reached out to you because I find your analysis like really, really good on Turkish economics and foreign policy and like where Turkey is today. But before we get into Turkey and what's happening there and like what your thoughts are over there, could you give me or give our listeners like your background story and like how you got into like political analysis and financial analysis of Turkey?
Sure. And so in terms of my background, in my early life, I studied at University of Edinburgh, got my bachelor's degree and an MBA, both from Edinburgh. And back then I was working as a software engineer for a small startup company in Scotland. And after that, I moved back to Turkey, which is where I'm from Istanbul, relocated there and joined another multinational IT company, which then took me to Dubai. And that's where I became more interested in the history, politics, and culture of the Middle East, the wider Middle East region, including Turkey, Eastern Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And so I decided to kind of do additional studies in political and economic analysis, but also more in sort of consultancy that would take me into another career path. So down about my sort of mid-career stage, I studied international affairs, both at master's and doctoral levels in the US, at Tufts University first, and then at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Washington, D.C. And that got me into my current role at Trends Research and Advisory, where I work as a senior fellow in strategic studies. So over the past 10 years or so, during this switch in my career, I did it gradually, didn't just jump from one track to the other, but sort of did it in a step-by-step manner, taking my studies together with my full-time work while trying to do as much publication and appearance on media as possible. Then finally, in 2020, I switched full-time to my current, role as an analyst, as a consultant in political and economic affairs. So currently I'm based in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. I've been here for just over a year. And before that, I was working as a freelancer part-time back in Istanbul, Turkey. So this is my second time living in the UAE. My first time was in my previous career as an IT consultant and a business development manager with a technology company in Dubai. And this is my second round now in a completely different capacity, role, and focus in the UAE, and also switch cities from Dubai to Abu Dhabi. So that's a quick summary of my background.
Nice. And like, how did you, like, when you shifted from, say, IT, when you did that for a long time, and then you shifted to this. Were you following more your passions, or were you following like just like you fancied a change? Why did you decide to do that?
Yeah, I was following my passions indeed. So even early days of my, academic career back at, college, I always had somewhere deep in my heart this keen interest to study history, politics, and I was always in debates with my friends around our college campus, but never found the opportunity to actually turn it into practice, to study it, learn it more, and apply it in real life. So down somewhere, after maybe let's say 10 years into my career as an IT professional, I, decided to first move into business. That's why I did the MBA in Edinburgh. That gradually got me into more sort of blue skies thinking and strategic mindset, where I started looking deeper into these different currents, the intersection between business and the political world, that through my studies, both here in the UAE and in the US, got me to where I am right now. So it was kind of this slow transition, first, starting off in a completely unrelated field in software engineering, but keeping my interest alive into business and into politics, then climbing these ladders gradually to shift away from, purely technical sort of life mode into more of analytical and consulting mindset, and gradually into this, role where it's kind of like an intersection between academia, think tank, and the media world. So I'm kind of in the middle of that triangle, where I do, publish and appear on media time to time, but I also try to, as much as possible, keep in contact with the academic world and do mentorship or give part-time classes and so on whenever there's an opportunity.
Fantastic. And Serhat, like when we look at Turkey, I would say, it's a very fascinating country. I mean, we spoke to Atilla Yaşar'da a few episodes ago. He gave us a nice overview of the Turkish economy and the Turkish political economy, say from like the early 2000s to today, the challenges and what's happening over there. But that was more of a general overview. But I'm keen to learn more or to understand more about the shifts since we spoke in May 2023, when the presidential elections. I think it's fair to say that since 2018, or say the last 5 or 6 years, Turkey's been in a bit of a difficult situation economically.
Yeah.
The unorthodox, or the so-called unorthodox economic policies, where President Erdogan, has this mentality or this fixation that low interest rates equates to low inflation. And a lot of analysts, and economists would say that this is one among many policy missteps that he did or he initiated back in 2013, which has led to things like runaway inflation. I think Turkey has one of the highest rates of inflation in the world. A completely weakened currency, falling FDI, economic contraction, all these negative things. What would, before 2023, or say within the last 5 years or 6 years, how would you categorize Turkey's economy?
I think for a long time it was on, an orthodox path. Let's say, take an example, for instance, 2001 or 2002, when the AKP came to power after a severe economic downturn and massive layoffs and unemployment in Turkey, where AKP sort of rode on that wave of popular backlash and toppled all the rest of the political parties and emerged as victor. So in the general elections, in an unprecedented move, and gained the majority of the seats in the parliament, and that's how Erdogan's government took power. So that's how his career started in at the governmental level. Before, he was the mayor of Istanbul, but afterwards he became an MP and the prime minister, and then thereon, the rest of the story. So that was the start of it, and for some time they followed the orthodox economic prescription set by the previous government, by the late Kemal Dervish of the World Bank, that anchored Turkey into the IMF program economically, and to EU membership prospect, which was still alive at the time, politically. So for about till, let's say, 2009, 2010, Turkey set the course straight and followed with liberal reforms, economic restructuring. Employment was booming, capital inflows just skyrocketed to scales never seen before. I mean, in just 1 year after Turkey gained, candidate status to the EU, there was an inflow of $20 billion just in 1 year, more than what it had received up to that point in the entire, Republican era. So that was a sign that, there was clear interests in what I would say the traditional financial institutes or the establishment in the West, in Europe and the US, to look upon Turkey as an exemplary case of an emerging country that blended Islam, Muslim values with democracy, a secular, government with sound economic reforms that is on a solid path to join the EU one day. But those hopes crumbled over the course of time. And I think, there were many reasons for that, both within the government in terms of internal strife among competing factions, like, for instance, the AKP's older cadres and Erdogan himself, or between the FETÖ, the Gülenists, the terrorist organization that attempted the failed coup in 2016, and the rest of the government apparatus or the state apparatus. So that culminated in a lot of ups and downs, and not to mention the, unfortunately, the failed prospect of Turkey's EU membership, especially, since Cyprus has gained entry into the Union in 2004, I think Turkey has lost much of its hope in that direction and sort of tried to drag its foot in applying EU reforms, because there was practically no chapter being concluded or new ones opened due to the veto, within the Union. So I think Turkey kind of lost its hope in anchoring firmly into, let's say, the economic and political entity of the Western world, and started to, chart a different course for itself, which we saw, with the beginning of the Arab uprisings or the political upheaval into 2011, culminated in Turkey, putting most of its energy and effort into activism and sort of building these bridges and expanding its influence in the Middle East and Africa rather than Europe. Over the course of time, then we saw, Turkey-US relations strained due to, again, various push and pull relationships, and not just because of bilateral issues, but also a changing world where we have a new a world order emerging on China, with China on one hand and a resurgent Russia, kind of this shift away from the unipolar world that we used to know, or we used to have since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and the transition away to a more multi-centered and even multipolar world, where I think Turkey found more avenue to claim agency and play, to its interests, rather than following a steadfast path as prescribed by, institutions of the West. I think that's kind of the summary of where these notable shifts in Turkish foreign policy happened, first with the EU focus, then a Middle Eastern focus, and then after 2016 till today, I think a more independent mindset that's kind of trying to navigate between these different poles and regional dynamics, but claiming agency and kind of grabbing its own decision-making power in its hand, rather than being more open or viable to influence from outside. I think that characterizes Turkey more these days than before.
And up until 2023, the economy was pretty bad, right, in terms of its indicators?
Yeah. So what happened was that in I think it was 2019, that inflation and the interest rate were at the same level. They were both about 19 to 20%. But then suddenly the government, AKP of President Erdogan, decided to apply an unorthodox way or an experiment to try to lower the interest rates and see whether that would lower the inflation in return. So he kind of reverted or inverted that relationship between the interest rates and inflation, as you also mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. I mean, I could possibly agree with him if what he meant was real interest rates, but that was not the case. Like, it was just plain nominal interest rates. If you drop them, you would see a drop in the inflation. That was his thesis, from what I understand, which didn't work out because of various reasons, but not the least of which is that Turkey is a dual currency economy almost. It's not just based on Turkish lira, but very much dollarized. You see the influence and sort of dominance even of the US dollar in everyday life, from purchasing of assets, commodities, everyday dealings, contracts, and everything. So in an economy that's so much dependent on inflow of foreign capital, especially, leave aside the FDI, but hot money in terms of portfolio inflows, there is very little you can do, without, accumulating, very little you can do in terms of, lowering the inflation without having first in place, a significant accumulation of capital, which is not the case because Turkey, or Turkey or Turkey, some people, or many people nowadays call Turkey because that's kind of like the official name. And I kind of use them interchangeably, but let's go Turkey, it's traditionally been a capital scarce and labor abundant country. Yes, it's been changing in recent years through upskilling and investment in capital intensive sectors like automotives, electronics. Turkey has repositioned itself as an industrial hub for emerging markets, especially in Middle East and Africa. It's become a technologically advanced and sophisticated society, but still the amount of consumption is so high. When you look at, the general economic identity, part of the GDP is consumption. So if consumption is so high and investments are low, there is inevitably going to be a current account deficit, which is Turkey's chronic problem. So in that atmosphere, that experiment that Erdogan tried to lower interest rates and control the inflation has failed, and it failed miserably. And that's where Turkey had to kind of reverse course. Yes, the AKP and Erdogan sailed through May 2023 elections and emerged as the first party, and he gained another term for 5 years to rule until 2028. But that doesn't mean that the public gave a blank check to Erdogan to just continue with his own economic unorthodox policies. On the contrary, so Erdogan understood that he has to reverse course, and that's why he brought in Mehmet Şimşek, a veteran, investment banker who has extensive experience in the UK and US financial markets to the helm of of financial management of the economy. He was the finance minister before, I think in 2009, 2010, when Turkey was still on the right course. So Erdogan called him back and put him at the helm of the Treasury, Finance Ministry, where he is now, I think, overseeing all this correction policy, to bring it back into an orthodox line of thinking. And I think we see the results. It's a bit too early to say, how soon Turkey can go back, if it ever, to a stable and kind of sound economy back in as it was before 2019. But I think the signs are there. At least there is confidence that the team that's at the head of economic management has the right kind of levers and connections to put it back on the right track. At least there is this confidence now, both within and outside of Turkey, which is a very important thing.
Yeah, like I think as you mentioned, right, when he was re-elected in May 2023, pretty quickly after or straight after, he appointed this team of conventional economic practitioners like Mehmet Şimşek, and then the former, well, she's gone now, but the former central bank governor who have experience on Wall Street, in addition to other people at the central bank and at the Treasury. And they kind of like initiated this like really high increasing interest rates, like hiking them. I think they're at 50% now today. So the cost of capital is higher, right?
Yes, and I think the next central bank meeting is on the 25th. And I mean, I haven't checked the latest comments on, whether it's likely to do another interest rate hike. Quite possibly, because it seems that inflation is still not under control, unlike what was expected, which also played a role partly, in the recent local elections where the opposition parties made a major return, and kind of people interpreted it as a reaction to Erdogan's, or residual effects of previous mismanagement during Erdogan's time. I think it was a reaction on that in that regard, because it's an unprecedented case. I mean, I see when I go back and shop or eat in Istanbul for vacation or just visits and so on. It's crazy. Like people complain, and their buying power, purchasing power, just erodes day by day. And the real inflation is probably above 80%, perhaps 100%. It was at some point 200%, I remember, when this crisis hit. So if the new economic management hadn't taken over the helm, we would have been in a much dire situation today than we could imagine. So I think in that sense, life in terms of sustaining living standards, covering living costs is a major hurdle for people, especially in mega cities like Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, where property prices are sky high, and food and basic things like food and energy prices are, for many people, it's unaffordable. So it's really hurting ordinary people that depend, waged population, which cannot adjust its income based, according to the inflation, unlike capital owners. So there is this, complaint or this general understanding, let's say, among especially the retired people, pensioners, that they are forced to, live or subsist on just, I would say, just over $300 a month, whereas the rest that makes up probably about half of the working population, including the minimum wage earners, whereas the rest of especially people around the government circles, the cronies and families connected to them, make just unbelievable fortunes, which we see all around in news and everywhere on social media, where they spend, lavishly on luxury goods and so on. So I think there is this social component to it as well, that people feel that they are trapped, that they are not empowered to make an impact or raise their voices or complaints to change the status quo. I think part of that was the reason why it kind of steamed out during the local elections, that people want change. People want to give a chance to the opposition to see if they can make a difference, and at least force the government to think of ways that to improve ordinary people's lives.
Yeah, and it just seems also, I remember when I was working for a financial journal in 2018, 2019, and that the Turkish banking sector was under a lot of stress in terms of liquidity. And one thing that I found interesting is that a lot of Turkish lira denominated deposits were the government was basically using their foreign currency reserves to prop up the Turkish lira, given the weakness in the currency and the inflation. Like, was that, in addition to the interest rates, that was quite bad as well, right?
Yeah, and this is what keeps coming up. It's a recurring topic that central bank reserves are at a minus almost 70 billion US dollars. If you take out the swap agreements with countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others, so it's in a dire situation. And just last year, it made a loss of about 20 billion US dollars because of this what it's called the savings account scheme, where people would convert their dollars into Turkish lira for the basic interest rate plus any change that they would gain on top via if there is the currency. I mean, Turkish lira depreciates. So and the bill just went straight to the central bank to foot it, and not the private sector, not the actual commercial banks, but to the central bank, because it was the underwriter of the scheme. It was either the Treasury or the central bank, but at the end they decided to take it out from the Treasury, because otherwise it would appear as a large hole in the budget, and instead put it under the central bank that now has to foot the bill. So all of these things feed into inflation and the lack of confidence in economic recovery. And inflation is the mother of all ills there, basically, because when there is inflation, people don't want to hold their Turkish lira denominations. They either convert it into dollars, gold, or if they can, expatriate it abroad, or you name it. Nobody wants to hold Turkish lira if there is inflation. So this is the main challenge the government has today, to rebuild that confidence and let people start making investments into Turkish assets again, so that that will actually set the precedent and example for foreigners to also come in and come back to Turkey to start thinking of investing. Maybe that takes us to the topic of FDI or its related issues. But I think this is the core of the problem. That even before the foreigners, I think there should be a significant effort to rebuild, the confidence from the Turkish population, from local citizens, and investors domiciled in Turkey itself.
Yeah, no, what's interesting also, before we get on to FDI, is that I haven't checked the figures for so far this year, but last year I think Turkey was like one of the most, in terms of Bitcoin mining or cryptocurrency usage, Turkey was like up there in terms of use for countries. So I guess people looking at alternative assets in addition to US dollars.
Oh, yeah. I mean, cryptocurrency is a huge game in Turkey. I think it's the third or the second in the world, correct me if I'm wrong, but after probably Nigeria, it's probably, one of the top in the game. So everyone, I remember this boom. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, I was just saying the hodl. Most Turks are probably like holding on for dear life.
Hodl, yeah. Hodl for
doesn't go in value, but I guess the Turkish lira has proved that. Serhat, before we get on to the FDI and the foreign policy shifts, one thing I wanted to ask you, and I asked Attila this as well, is that this mentality that Erdogan had, there hasn't been that many examples in the past, say, 20 years where the so-called Islamic economics has really, if you take out Iran and Sudan, which is now shifting more to a conventional banking policy, there are countries which have tried Islamic banking, like Pakistan, and I think Libya, they're trying, given all that stuff. Why does Erdogan feel that he needs to implement this kind of economic model?
I think he always had it somewhere in the back of his mind from day one. It's just a matter of finding the opportunity and gathering power to go ahead and implement it. It's not something that he came up recently or he read somewhere and, let's say, decided to experiment with it on the next day. No, I think he had this mentality of returning to the way economy was during the time of the Prophet, during the early days of Islam. I think that's something not just him, but several other people or major influencers around him, that cadre of consultants that has sort of propped up this idea. Even if he had put it aside at some point, there must have been someone who just brought it back into the agenda, saying, dear sir, we had this kind of scheme in place. Why don't we just at least try? Whoever that was, we don't know who gave that prescription, where that mindset came from. There are various, speculations and theories about it, but I think Erdogan genuinely believed in it. He didn't like say, oh, I don't know how it would work out, but let's just give it a try. I think he genuinely believed in it in a die-hard manner. And if he had the power to do so, he would continue right to the end. But unfortunately, the situation Turkey found itself in 2022 was a disaster. I mean, with central bank reserves not just depleted, but in severe negative territory, capital flying out, investments dying, no one's, looking at Turkish assets in a favorable manner. The stock market had, pretty much, dried off. So how else could he bring, the activity or like say this interest back into the economy, or through confidence building measures like bringing Mehmet Şimşek back, like hiring Hafize Gaye Erkan at least for some time to rebuild confidence from foreign investors that there is at least some sound economic management. I don't know if we were in a different world, if we were at a different time, Erdogan's theory might have worked out. But unfortunately, this is not the case. I mean, Turkey doesn't set the terms and conditions of the global, higher echelons of the global economic order, for good or bad. And I understand that Erdogan has this mantra of the world is bigger than five. There needs to be a more equitable global governance with involvement from emerging or middle powers in deciding on the future of humanity and so on. And these are all good things, but to actually experiment with it as if that ideal is already in place today is something that you wouldn't want to do, because then you kind of fly the country off the cliff into an unknown. And this is a disastrous experiment. I mean, you wouldn't do that with you. I mean, it's almost like gambling. So I don't know, to be honest. I mean, it sounds like a bit of irrationality, but there may have been some rationality behind it by someone who genuinely believed in the truth or the benefit of that scheme if it ever worked out.
Yeah, I always say to people, and we had Haris Irfan on a few episodes ago about Islamic banking model, and to me, Islamic banking or the Islamic economic model is completely different to what we have today, is where it's a conventional fractional banking system where commercial credit is created, but that's another discussion for another day. But one thing that was interesting, Serhat, is that obviously now that he won the elections in 2023, he doesn't seem to have any problem with interest rates going up now. So I guess his religious conviction didn't match up to like 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, or maybe that was just a cover-up story. I don't know. So maybe there were cronies, as I said, some connections, some people with vested interests that made fortunes out of this, pump and dump. You know what I mean? So
yeah, exactly.
if it could well have been the case, and Erdogan may be unaware of it. He doesn't, as a human being, possibly he doesn't know everything of what's going on around him or in Turkey. Yes, there may be reports and updates, people telling him about, recent developments, but maybe he doesn't, or he didn't see that aspect of it. Who knows? So, I mean, if it were up to him, maybe he would take a different course. Maybe he was just being the sort of the voice, the figurehead, the prompter for the scheme, thinking that it would genuinely benefit people. But it didn't turn out to be the case for the reason I mentioned earlier, because the world economic system just isn't based on the parameters that Erdogan or his advisors, consultants had advised him to be in place. It just isn't. Or maybe they knew it, but they wanted to give it a try nevertheless, thinking that there may be followers, people would genuinely uptake that idea and support him. But look, I mean, if you go back several years ago, I think it was in 2019 or 18, maybe. I think it was 18, when Erdogan urged people to dump their dollars and collect Turkish lira, and you were seeing people on streets burning US dollars, or chanting and dancing and stepping on US dollars on the street, saying champion Turkish lira, and this kind of popular reaction. Maybe that's what he was counting on, to sort of garner that kind of support from the street to his economic, or let's say economic prescription in Islamic terms. but it didn't work out this time. Maybe there was some benefit, some beneficiary or beneficiaries of it, but in the grand scheme of things, it hurt ordinary people much more than it benefited Erdogan's close cadres.
Yeah. So Hart, in tandem with the economic shifts after the presidential elections last year in May, there was also notable foreign policy shifts, which I know you've written about, and I wanted to get your take on that. There was a rapprochement between Erdogan or Ankara and some of the Gulf states that previously they had a bit of tensions with them over different issues. I guess what was interesting to me is that the UAE, Erdogan, I think the first visit he made was either to the UAE or to Saudi. Talk a little bit about this rapprochement and what it means for Turkey's economy.
Sure. I think in this whole rapprochement scheme, there is a big element of quest for strategic autonomy. It's a major driving factor, and that means risk sharing by hedging against changes in the U.S. government, in U.S. foreign policy, not putting all your eggs into the same basket, and sort of trying to diversify your partnerships as much as possible to not be in a position to find yourself in a hot seat where you'd have to go to the IMF or which is a politically sensitive issue, especially if we look at Turkey's case, because it's been Erdogan's rhetoric that Turkey will not go back to the IMF again to seek economic or financial assistance. So to sort of diversify its economic partners, but also garner political capital, I think Erdogan decided to reconcile with the rest of the region. That's one thing. And the second is that, the Arab uprisings or the popular upheavals have failed, and they have not achieved the change or the, kind of political shift that Erdogan and his party had hoped for in the first place. So he saw the reality and, kind of adopted to this new era of reconciliation. And there was also a reciprocal interest. If you look at the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others, it started with the Alula summit in 2021. Before that, there was the Abraham Accords between Israel and a couple of other countries. Then Morocco and Sudan came. And as you also mentioned, reciprocal visits since 2021. And they saw that kind of these areas for cooperation, especially in economic terms, but also to hedge against security risks. These are greater and more profitable in comparison to pursuit of isolated national goals, like to try to invade country A or topple government B and so on, and without naming the names. So these were kind of unproductive pursuits. And so Erdogan government and Turkey returned to, just as they returned to economic orthodoxy, I think they returned to political rationality and orthodoxy, thinking in terms of, realistic ways or policies, looking through a realistic lens to the region and also to the wider globe. So that means they prioritized economic bridge building over geopolitical saber rattling. We see an example of this, them not joining Western sanctions on Russia, Ukraine war. They take a non-aligned stance and maintain their relations with both sides. Although we don't see that in the Gaza conflict, but clearly that's, I think, no matter what the rhetoric or the high talk about it is, I think Ukraine-Russia issue is a much bigger item on Turkish foreign policy agenda than Israel-Palestine or the Gaza war case is or will ever be. And geography is a big enabler here because it connects, these lucrative sub-regions from the Gulf to the Eastern Mediterranean to the Black Sea. An example of which you see, for instance, yesterday Erdogan and Turkish cabinet ministers visited Iraq, where they inked an MOU with Qatar, UAE, and Turkey and Iraq, of course, to build a transport link from Basra through Turkey onto Europe, which is dubbed as the Development Road Project. So that's another case of sort of collective economic development that Turkey has been more inclined to since 2021. Yeah, I'll stop at that. And if you have any more
No,
questions on that, we can discuss. Yeah.
it's interesting. Like obviously the UAE and Saudi Arabia to more extent is, they're engaging in their own economic diversification plans, and with the
Yeah.
giga projects in Saudi Arabia. I remember, I think when we spoke, there was an article in Bloomberg about how Turkish contractors were bidding for projects in Saudi Arabia. So obviously this
Yeah.
is lucrative for Turkish corporates as well, right?
Yeah, big time. And you see interest in Turkish construction companies being involved, or if it ever materializes, of course, in the development road project. So there were news that the size of, for instance, Saudi construction projects could be up to 50 billion US dollars. We're looking at 17 billion US dollars in Iraq. So construction is one of the sort of flagship industries, especially in terms of foreign currency, inflows. It's one of the major, sectors that Erdogan has invested in since he came to power. For good or bad, there's a lot of criticism around, and many people who raise voices over, sort of unchecked or unfettered growth of, this construction boom in Turkey that kind of destroyed much of the natural habitat or people's livelihoods. But that's another story. Overall, I think in abroad, Turkey has done many successful projects, especially in the Near East.
And even before 2021, Gulf cash was quite important to the Turkish treasury, right?
Yeah.
Like how important was the Gulf credit lines to Turkey's economy, or the Turkish central bank rather?
People were. I read on news that there were lines of credit or swap lines extended on the scale of like $5 billion, $10 billion, but nothing more than that. It's not sort of on a major scale as 50 to $100 billion. For instance, think of Erdogan's visit to the UAE last year, where they again signed the preliminary agreement on potential package of investment deals. Or up to 50 billion US dollars over the course of next 10 years. This will probably materialize in a step-by-step manner. There were big expectations or hopes that, all of a sudden this whole $50 billion will pour into Turkey and sort of save it out of the economic dire states it's been sailing through. But that's not the case. This is a long-term vision. It's not a portfolio investment, and for better, than I would say portfolio investment or hot money is probably a much bigger trouble than Turkey would like to see, because it's a kind of temporary investment where people arbitrate and come in and make cash, take profits and return, rather than foreign direct investment, which is more a longer term, more permanent engagement, and this is what Turkey should hope for. Rather than portfolio investment for short-term gains, which comes at a very high interest rate, 10% plus in dollar terms, and an added risk premium, as you know. So it's good that countries in the Gulf, their strategies coincide with, lucrative opportunities in Turkey, because they want to diversify their investment and move into more value-added sectors like healthcare, technology, mobility, and clean energy, which Turkey wants to sort of build upon and to become more of a knowledge economy and move away from this let's say over dependence on cheap labor. Because labor in Turkey is still cheaper than many countries. Even at some point it was, or maybe still is, cheaper than China, believe it or not. But and that's why I think partly why some Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers were interested in building factories in Turkey, and didn't happen because of other reasons. But I think labor in Turkey is still relatively cheaper than many other places.
As we bring the podcast to a close shortly, Serhat, there's one other area that you and I talk about a lot is FDI, foreign direct investment. Obviously, Turkey needs a lot of FDI, and you talked a lot about the hot money and equity investments. One thing since the May 2023, right, is that a lot of orthodox policies have returned, higher interest rates, a lot of these other policies which were done have been undone. But the one thing that's interesting is that financial flows seem to be returning. We had the sovereign issued its bonds. The sovereign wealth fund, I think, also issued bonds earlier this year. The equity market in Turkey seems to be doing really well, but the FDI, greenfield FDI, doesn't seem to be returning. Like, do you have any high-level thoughts on FDI, like why it's not coming back so quickly?
Yeah, I think it's partly because of the democratic backsliding and lack of rule of law and standards or selective application of law, as many people also point out. I think that partly plays into it, because when an investor comes, they would undoubtedly like to see a level playing field, not be called upon to give concessions or make payments here and there, or return the favor in some other way via some random request from a government entity or a person. So they would like to see some kind of predictability and stability. I think that's one of the major reasons why greenfield investment hasn't returned to Turkey. So instead, and not even that, but even equity investments are not even up to the level that Turkey would have expected to see. Much of Western investment comes largely with what's called these Washington consensus conditions, as attachments or preconditionalities, such as improvements in Turkey's human rights record, as I mentioned, rule of law, institutional and regulatory quality, and control of corruption. So I think to go down that path would be politically costly for Erdogan and unfavorable, because he has built so much political capital by resisting, or appearing to resist at least, sort of these Western demands on reforms and putting liberal democratic reforms back on the path that he had embarked upon before let's say 2010s. So the positive thing is sound financial management under Mehmet Şimşek and his team sort of gives confidence to traditional investors, but they still require much more than that. And you touched upon Gulf countries, whether they would bring in more money in terms of greenfield investment. Possibly, but let's remember that they're also competing to attract FDI now with Turkey, with ambitious transformation programs like Saudi Vision 2030 and UAE Vision 2031. Their approach or view toward Turkey is now very different than it was, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. So that kind of plays into the amount of or the size of the capital pool that's available for Turkey, which means it would have to look at alternative avenues. And if you look around, there's not that many, because yes, Central Asian Turkic republics are Turkey's close, historic and culturally close partners, but there's not that much of an interest there, or for that matter, ability or capital to invest in Turkey. So the other avenue would be the EU, and that's looking unlikely for the reasons explained above. Neither the US or China, because China still has a lot of other priorities than to invest in a country like Turkey in a substantial or meaningful way. We see a lot of investment, yes, but there is also a lot of skepticism, I think, on the Chinese side as to Turkey's viability and reliability as a significant partner in the region. I hope that will change. I hope that Turkey can diversify its partnerships and draw in more sort of value-added capital, not just into mines and these kind of extractive sectors, but into building factories, high technology, and job-creating sectors that will increase also demand for skilled people.
What about some of the reforms that the government is trying? Like, I mean, there's this data protection law that they're updating to make it easier for tech companies to take certain data points out of the country. That's just one of the reforms that they're trying to propose. Do you think that these are going to help FDI, or do you think, like as you said, it's going to take time for it to come?
I think that's standard across the board, isn't it? I mean, when you look at other countries in the Gulf or elsewhere, Europe is much more strict on this than Turkey. And, Turkey has kind of entered the game late in enacting these regulations and rules. So it's quite normal that an international or multinational software house or a social media company or any technology company for that matter that has a substantial number of subscribers or customers in Turkey has to play the game by the rules. So you can't just get advertisement revenue and all this interest and number of subscribers and not pay anything. So there needs to be some kind of return, some offset that would allow the Turkish government to continue to invest and build the level playing field, as opposed to taking protectionist measures and just propping up local Turkish companies or trying to sort of substitute them with their local equivalents. So I think this is I don't see it as a big matter, because this data localization or data protection is pretty much standard now across as a requirement. Maybe there are different standards, but as a kind of principle, it's standard across the globe. You look at the US, you see that in China the same. I mean, look, the US is going to ban TikTok if it doesn't divest off, from the mother company. And so these kind of measures, they don't happen in Turkey, but I think it needs to kind of take some measures to be able to protect its interests.
I have two other questions for you, Serhat.
Yeah.
They're kind of interconnected. The first is obviously with the municipal elections, which took place on the 31st of March, so not too long ago. This had a really profound impact, I think, on a lot of sentiment towards Erdogan. I think one of the things that was interesting is that I think one of the candidates is the mayor of one of the cities. He's now considered like the front runner against Erdogan in the next presidential election. So how bad is this, or how does this impact Erdogan and his policy making? And linked to that question is like, what are your thoughts on the Turkish economy for the rest of this year and for the next couple of years?
So in terms of the runner-up competitor, who is Mr. Ekrem İmamoğlu, the current mayor of Istanbul, he's a viable candidate. I think he solidified this seat and certainly has the upper hand as an untried, let's say untried in the sense that he hasn't ruled in the central government yet, but he has proven his ability and success at the helm of Istanbul, and that kind of elevates him. He probably will use this as a jump board, as a board to sort of jump to his next step. If he had done it in the previous round, like last year, as many people had hoped for, i.e., if he had run for presidency, yes, he could have won. But I think that would have been a mistake, because he was back then still in his first term as the mayor of Istanbul. There is no rush. I think there's a saying that politics, or maybe international relations, is a food eaten cold. So, you have to finish that first round and complete your duties, prove yourself, have your bread, eat it, and then move on to the next step. I think that's a much more solid way, a proven or guaranteed way of success for your next, career venture, whatever it is, in politics. So he has done the right thing by not, putting himself in line, even though many people predict or have predicted that he would have won had he been proposed or nominated as a candidate. So I think he stands a good chance. It's still early to say, because we don't know yet who will be Erdogan's successor, who he will nominate, if anyone, or whether there is likelihood of some kind of a change or a modification in the constitution or another way around to sort of extend his term. We don't know. So there are many unknowns out there, but İmamoğlu, the current mayor of Istanbul, is certainly a much more powerful and viable candidate now than he was a month ago. I think on your second question, it was about the state of Turkish economy today, and
How does
so for the rest of this year, yeah.
Yeah, how does that impact and the outlook for Turkey's economy going forward?
I mean, what's observed today is that there is still no significant decline in inflationary trend, despite earlier forecasts by the finance minister Mehmet Şimşek himself. So there is now a renewed interest from abroad that Turkey, might return or at least sustain this economic orthodoxy, even if there's a change of government, so that there won't be a rollback to the old days of just skiing off the slope and going into the unknown. Despite the central bank's negative net reserves, fiscal deficits, maturing short-term debt, and the overall health of the economy, there is, I think, a light at the end of the tunnel that this kind of internal political balance between the opposition and the government, because previously the opposition was too weak. Now they've expanded their hold and influence, so which may force the government's hand to enact some reforms or continue the orthodox path that it would otherwise attempt to change. Which gives more hope and confidence to people that this is going to last longer until maybe Turkey one day goes back to the state of the healthy economy that it was in before.
Great. And Serhat, what are your current projects? Are you working on anything interesting or got anything interesting coming up?
Well, I just returned from a conference in Washington last month. So it was the inaugural Gulf Studies Symposium at Georgetown University, organized by the Gulf International Forum. And we from Trends attended the team of four, where we discussed and presented our findings on some of the transformation initiatives in the Gulf, but more specifically about the Saudi Vision 2030 and how that plays out in the grand scheme of international affairs in the region. So that was an interesting experience among all these accomplished scholars, academics, and practitioners to sort of discuss developments in the region. In terms of projects, what else? So we have the Abu Dhabi Book Fair coming up soon. So it will be from 29th of April to 4th of May. And we just wrapped up an edited volume of 9 chapters about global trends in artificial intelligence. And I was the chief editor of the book, along with two of my colleagues. So, and also co-authored a chapter in the book. So that's my next project, set to go live soon, hopefully. And then we'll see what the rest of the year brings, mostly on writing articles again, and media commentary and analysis, and maybe some time off during the nice summer in Turkey as well.
Great. And are you active on social media?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I'm on YouTube and I am on Twitter.
Great.
What's your LinkedIn?
What's your Twitter handle so people can reach you?
Yeah. It's my first middle name, Suha C. So @ and then Suha, SUHA, and my surname initial C, Suha C.
Great. This has been fantastic. Serhat, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Most welcome, Hassan. It's my pleasure, and thanks for your questions and this great opportunity to chat with you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.